Out here in the unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory, the land doesn't give up its secrets easily. It buries them under layers of red rock and scorching sun. This is a story about one of those secrets. It's about a man who had already buried his heart, a forgotten rancher named Matthew Stone, living like a ghost in a land of ghosts. And it's about a child, an Apache girl, who was saved from the jaws of death only to disappear back into the wilderness. Most stories would end there. But the desert remembers. And years later, when war drums echoed in the canyons, and a tide of violence threatened to wash away everything that man had left, the desert sent its answer. It sent back the girl he had saved, but she wasn't a girl anymore. She was a legend. This is the story of the forgotten rancher and the Apache chief. The year was 1878. The Arizona Territory was a raw, open wound, still weeping from a decade of brutal conflict between the settlers and the NDR, the people the whites called Apache. For Matthew "Matt" Stone, the war was just a distant echo, a dull ache that resonated with the phantom pains of his own past. His war had been fought back east, a maelstrom of cannon smoke and brother against brother that had cost him a leg and a piece of his soul. It had been followed by the cholera that cost him his wife, Martha, and their boy, Samuel. All that was left of his old life was a tarnished silver locket he kept in his breast pocket and the sprawling, silent emptiness of the Broken Spur Ranch. The Broken Spur was aptly named. Tucked into a rugged box canyon bordering the Chiricahua Mountains, it was a place of broken dreams and broken promises. The land was hard, the water was fickle, and the solitude was a physical presence, as real as the sawtooth peaks that clawed at the impossibly blue sky. Matt liked it that way. Solitude couldn't betray you. The silence didn't ask questions. He was checking a dry wash fence line, his bay gelding dusty, picking its way through the scree and mesquite, when he first heard it. It wasn't the lonely cry of a single coyote, a sound as common as the sunset. This was different. A frantic, snarling pack, punctuated by a thin, high-pitched sound that was terrifyingly human. Matt's hand instinctively went to the Winchester 73, holstered on his saddle. He wasn't a hero. The part of him that ran towards trouble had died at Antietam. But the sound, that thin thread of a child's terror, snagged on something deep inside him, a rusty, paternal instinct he thought long buried with his son. Cursing under his breath, he spurred Dusty up the rocky incline towards the source of the commotion. He crested a small ridge and saw them. A pack of 6, maybe 7 gaunt, desperate coyotes had cornered something against a sheer rock face. They were a whirlwind of mangy fur and bared teeth, snapping and lunging. Their prey was a small child, no older than 5 or 6, backed into a shallow crevice. The child was small, with skin the color of rich earth and straight black hair matted with dust and blood. A tattered buckskin dress hung from a tiny frame. An Apache girl. Matt's gut twisted. In this part of the territory, an Apache was trouble. Helping one could get a man branded a traitor, or worse, get him killed. The local sentiment whipped up by land prospectors and bitter ex-soldiers was that the only good Apache was a dead one. Matt had heard the talk in the nearby settlement of Dust Devil Creek. He'd seen the wanted posters for Geronimo and Cochise. He knew the risks. But then one of the coyotes lunged, and the little girl swung a rock clutched in her tiny fist, her face a mask of primal fear and defiance. In that defiant gesture, Matt didn't see an Apache. He saw a child. He saw Samuel small and fierce, defending a wooden fort from imaginary bandits. The memory broke through his apathy like a flash flood. Before he could think it through, Matt raised the Winchester to his shoulder. The first shot was a thunderclap that echoed through the canyon, sending a puff of dust into the ribs of the lead coyote. It yelped and collapsed in a heap. The second shot took down another that was trying to circle around. The rest of the pack, startled by the sudden violence, scattered, melting back into the scrubland like grey ghosts. Silence descended heavy and immediate. Matt dismounted, his bad leg protesting as he slid from the saddle. He approached the rock face slowly, his rifle held loosely at his side. The little girl was curled into a tight ball, her face hidden in her arms, trembling uncontrollably. A nasty gash ran down her forearm, where one of the coyotes had managed to get a hold of her. "Easy now," Matt said, his voice raspy from disuse. "It's all right. They're gone." She didn't move. She was a creature of the wild, cornered and terrified. He knew getting any closer might spook her into bolting. He stood there for a long moment, the setting sun casting his long shadow over her. He saw the tracks around the area, a single set of small footprints and nothing else. No sign of family, no sign of a tribe. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. Matt let out a long sigh, the sound of a man resigning himself to a fate he didn't choose. He couldn't leave her here. Whether she was Apache or not, leaving a child for the scavengers wasn't in his nature, no matter how much he'd tried to kill that nature off. He walked back to Dusty and unstrapped his canteen and a small bundle of jerky. He placed them on the ground about 10 feet from the girl, then backed away and sat on a nearby boulder, making himself as non-threatening as possible. "Water," he said, pointing to the canteen. He waited. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of blood and fire. The air grew cold. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the small form stirred. A pair of wide, dark eyes, as deep and ancient as the canyon itself, peeked out from behind her arms. They watched him unblinking, filled with a caution that no child should ever have to learn. Slowly, hesitantly, she crawled forward, a wounded animal, approaching a potential trap. She snatched the canteen, her movements swift and silent, and scuttled back to her crevice. Matt heard the sound of her gulping down the water. He had saved her from the coyotes. Now a far more dangerous question loomed in the twilight. What in God's name was he going to do with her? Taking her to his ranch was an invitation for trouble. Taking her to town was a death sentence. For the first time in years, Matthew Stone was well and truly stumped, and the answer was staring at him from the shadows with the oldest eyes he had ever seen. Bringing the girl back to the broken spur was a silent, tense affair. She refused to ride with him, her small body rigid with mistrust. So Matt walked, leading Dusty, with one hand his rifle in the other, while the girl trailed about 20 feet behind a small shadow, flitting between boulders and cacti, her eyes never leaving his back. It was the slowest journey he'd ever made. Every snap of a twig made her freeze, ready to bolt. His cabin was a simple, sturdy structure of hewn pine, smelling of wood smoke, old leather and loneliness. When he pushed the door open and lit the lantern, the girl wouldn't cross the threshold. She stood outside in the encroaching darkness, a wild thing, hesitating at the door of a cage. "You can't stay out there." Matt grumbled more to himself than to her. He didn't force it. He took a spare wool blanket and laid it on the porch near the door, then went inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. He moved about his nightly rituals, stoking the fire, making coffee, frying a few strips of bacon. The smell filled the small cabin. He ate his portion in silence, then left a plate with bacon and a piece of cornbread on the porch next to the blanket. He went to his cot and lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. He listened. For a long while, there was only the sound of the wind whispering through the canyon. Then a faint rustling, the soft scrape of the plate on the wooden porch boards. He heard quiet, deliberate chewing, a small victory. He finally drifted off to the sound of her soft breathing just outside his door. The first week was a delicate dance of patience and fear. She remained mute. He never learned her name, and she never offered it. He tried talking to her, telling her about the ranch, about Dusty, about anything to fill the oppressive silence, but his words seemed to vanish into the air. In turn, he learned to read her language, the slight tilt of her head, the widening of her eyes, the way she held her shoulders. He tended to the gash on her arm with a gentle efficiency that surprised even himself, cleaning it with carbolic soap and wrapping it in clean rags. She flinched at his touch, but didn't pull away, watching his large, calloused hands with an unnerving intensity. He decided to call her Lily. He'd found her near a patch of wild mariposa lilies, one of the few delicate things that thrived in this harsh land. It seemed to fit. "Lily," he said one afternoon, pointing to himself. "Matthew, Matt." He then pointed to her. "Lily." She just stared, her dark eyes giving nothing away. But a few days later, while he was mending a bridle, he dropped his awl. Before he could bend his stiff leg to retrieve it, a small hand shot out, picked it up and offered it to him. "Matt." She whispered the word, barely a breath. It was the first word she had spoken. It hit him with the force of a physical blow, a crack in the icy wall he'd built around his heart. From that day on, the frost between them began to thaw. She started following him on his rounds, her silence no longer one of fear, but of observation. He was a man of routine, and she became a part of it. She learned to fetch his tools to check the water level in the trough. She had an uncanny connection to the land. She could spot a rattlesnake before it coiled, find hidden pockets of water after a rare rain, and read the clouds for a coming storm better than any almanac. She was teaching him about his own land, the one he thought he knew. In return, he started teaching her his world. In the evenings by the firelight, he'd take a charred stick and draw letters in the dirt floor. ABC, he'd point to the fire. FIRE, to the cup. CUP. Her mind was a sponge. She soaked it all up with a quiet, fierce determination. The world of written words opened up to her, and in it she found a way to ask the questions her voice had been too afraid to utter. The fragile peace they had built, however, could not remain isolated. The world had a way of creeping in. Matt needed supplies, which meant a trip to Dust Devil Creek, a grimy collection of saloons, a general store, and a blacksmith's shop, populated by hard-bitten prospectors, cowboys and settlers who viewed the Apache with a mixture of fear and genocidal hatred. He couldn't leave her alone for 2 days, and he couldn't possibly take her with him. But his flour was gone, and his coffee was running low. He had no choice. He dressed her in a spare shirt of his, cinched with a rope belt, which hung on her like a sack, and put an old floppy hat on her head to hide her hair and face. "Stay close to the wagon," he ordered, his voice tight. "Don't talk to anyone. Don't even look at anyone." She simply nodded, her eyes wide. Dust Devil Creek was a shock to her system. The noise, the smells, the sheer number of people. Men stared as they passed. A few pointed. The word squaw was muttered low and venomous. Matt felt his hand clench into a fist. He hustled her into Miller's Mercantile, the air thick with the scent of pickles tobacco and bolts of calico. While Matt was bartering with Old Man Miller for flour and beans, Lily stood frozen by the door. That's when he walked in. Silas Kane. Kane was a man who was buying up land all over the territory, not with a homesteader's sweat, but with a predator's cunning. He was dapper in a way that was unsettling in the dusty town, with a silk vest and a predatory smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He owned the biggest saloon and held the mortgages of half the men in town. Kane's eyes swept the store and landed on the small, strangely dressed child by the door. His smile widened. "Well, well, Matthew Stone." Kane said, his voice smooth as snake oil. "Didn't take you for the family type. Finally got tired of rattling around that broken-down ranch of yours alone. What I do on my ranch is my business." "Kane," Matt said, his voice flat and hard. Kane strolled closer, circling Lily like a vulture. He reached out to tip her hat off, but Matt moved with a speed that belied his limp stepping between them. His body was a solid wall. "Don't," was all he said. The word was cold steel. Kane held his hands up in mock surrender, but his eyes glittered with malice. "Just being neighborly. But a man has to be careful who he keeps company with these days. Some folks might get the wrong idea. Might think you're a sympathizer. And we all know what happens to sympathizers out here." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Old Man Miller suddenly became very busy counting his cans of peaches. Kane tipped his hat, gave Matt one last venomous smile, and swaggered out of the store. The ride back to the Broken Spur was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. The fragile peace had been shattered. The outside world in the form of Silas Kane had found them. Matt knew Kane wanted his land. He had the only year-round spring in the whole canyon. Now Kane had found a new weapon to use against him. He had found Lily. Silas Kane was not a man to make idle threats. He was a patient predator, preferring to encircle his prey, cut off its resources, and wait for it to weaken before moving in for the kill. The Broken Spur, with its invaluable spring, was the prize he coveted most in the region, and Matthew Stone was the stubborn obstacle in his way. Now, with the Apache girl in the picture, Kane saw a lever he could use to pry Matt loose. The harassment started subtly, a section of fence cut in the dead of night, allowing a dozen head of cattle to wander off into the labyrinthine canyons. Matt and Lily spent 3 grueling days tracking them, finding only half. A week later, the wooden flume that carried water from the spring to the main trough was smashed at the precious water, spilling uselessly into the thirsty sand. Matt repaired it, his jaw set in a grim line, while Lily kept watch from the rocks above, a small, silent sentinel. She had become his eyes and ears. Her senses, honed by a life in the wild, were far sharper than his. She could hear the approach of a horse long before he could spot the glint of a spyglass on a distant ridge. They were a team forged in the crucible of shared adversity. "It's Kane's men," Matt said one evening, cleaning his Winchester by the fire. "He's trying to bleed me out. Make it too hard to stay." Lily, who was now tracing words from Matt's worn-out copy of the Bible onto a piece of slate, looked up. Her English was still halting, but her understanding was sharp. "We fight?" she asked, her small hand curling into a fist. Matt looked at her at the firelight dancing in her determined eyes. A sad smile touched his lips. "We hold on, Lily. We just hold on." But Kane escalated. One sweltering afternoon, 2 of his hired guns, a hulking brute named Pike and a weaselly man called Colby, rode onto Matt's land. They didn't bother with the main path, instead cutting straight across his meager pasture. Matt met them on the porch, his shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. Lily was inside, peeking through a crack in the door. "Stone," Pike grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Matt's boots. "Mr. Kane sent us. He's made you a final offer for this pile of rocks. $500. More than it's worth." "It's not for sale," Matt said, his voice dangerously quiet. Colby snickered. "Maybe you ain't heard. The commissioner's put a new bounty on Apache scalps. $50 apiece. You got one in there right. Sell her and you can add it to the pot. Maybe then you can afford a real ranch." Matt's face went white. The casual cruelty of the words, the idea of putting a price on Lily's life, ignited a rage in him he hadn't felt since the war. His thumb moved, cocking both hammers of the shotgun. The double click was deafening in the silence. "You've got 10 seconds to get off my land," Matt snarled, his eyes burning with cold fire. "After that, I'm going to start counting in buckshot." Pike and Colby exchanged a look. They were bullies, not fighters, at least not against a man who looked like he meant it. They backed their horses away, muttering curses. "You'll regret this stone Kane gets what he wants," they shouted, before galloping off. Matt stood there for a long time, the heavy shotgun feeling like an extension of his own righteous anger. He felt a small hand slip into his. He looked down. Lily was standing beside him, her face pale, but her eyes fierce. She wasn't afraid. She was angry. In that moment, their bond was sealed, not in gratitude or dependence, but in shared defiance. The incident galvanized Matt. He was no longer just a man trying to be left alone. He was a man protecting his family. That's what she had become. The daughter he never got to see grow up the purpose that had been stolen from him. He began to fortify the ranch. He boarded up the back window of the cabin, reinforced the corral fence, and established a series of lookout points in the rocks overlooking the main trail. He also intensified Lily's education, both in letters and in survival. He taught her how to handle a rifle, how to load and fire the small .22 he used for varmints. "I pray you never have to use this on a man," he told her, his hands guiding her small ones on the stock. But this world doesn't care much for prayers. She in turn taught him the silent ways of the Apache. She showed him how to build a smokeless fire in a small pit, how to use yucca fibers to make incredibly strong rope, and how to move through the treacherous terrain without making a sound. He was the grizzled old bear teaching her the ways of the settler's world. She was the young hawk teaching him the secrets of the land they both stood on. Their quiet life was now one of constant vigilance. The shadow of Silas Kane was a permanent fixture, a storm cloud on the horizon that refused to dissipate. Kane's attacks grew bolder. One night they were awakened by the smell of smoke. The hay barn was ablaze, the flames leaping into the dark sky like demonic fingers. They managed to save the horses, but the barn and a winter's worth of feed were lost. They stood watching the structure collapse into a pile of glowing embers, the heat a stark contrast to the cold dread in Matt's stomach. This was more than just harassment now. This was a declaration of war. Kane would not stop until the broken spur was his, or Matt was in the ground. "He will not win," Lily said, her voice small, but hard as flint. She looked up at Matt, her face illuminated by the dying flames. There was no trace of the terrified child he had found in the canyon. In her place was a young girl with the eyes of a warrior. "No, he won't," Matt agreed, putting a protective arm around her shoulder. "Not while I'm still breathing." But as he looked at the smoldering ruins, a chilling thought took root in his mind. He could protect her from coyotes and hired thugs. But how could he protect her from the full weight of a world that hated her for what she was? Kane's greatest weapon wasn't fire or guns. It was prejudice, and that was a fire Matt didn't know how to fight. 3 years passed. The constant pressure from Kane became a grim part of their existence, like the relentless summer heat. Lily, now nearly 10, had grown from a timid fawn into a whip-smart, resilient girl. She could read and write better than many of the folks in town. She could track a deer for miles, and she could handle the .22 with unnerving accuracy. The cabin at the Broken Spur was no longer a refuge for a broken man, but a home filled with the quiet hum of two lives intertwined. The bond between Matt and Lily had deepened into a profound, unspoken love. For her, he was the only father she had ever known, a bastion of safety and knowledge. For him, she was a miracle, a desert flower that had bloomed from the ashes of his life, giving him a reason to face each sunrise. He had long since stopped seeing her as an Apache girl. She was just Lily, his Lily. But the land has a memory, and blood calls to blood. It happened on a crisp autumn morning. Matt was repairing a saddle on the porch, and Lily was practicing her letters on her slate. A strange stillness fell over the canyon, the kind that precedes a storm. The birds went silent. Dusty in his corral grew restless, snorting and stamping a hoof. Lily was the first to sense it. She lifted her head, her body going completely still, her eyes fixed on the high ridge that formed the northern wall of their canyon. "What is it?" Matt asked, following her gaze. At first he saw nothing. Then, like figures emerging from a mirage, they appeared. 5 riders silhouetted against the morning sun. They weren't cowboys or prospectors. They sat on their horses with a natural ease that spoke of a life spent in the saddle. They were lean, long-haired, and armed with bows and rifles. Apache. Matt's blood ran cold. He scrambled inside, grabbing his Winchester, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pushed Lily behind him. "Stay inside! Don't make a sound!" he commanded. The riders did not approach recklessly. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose down the winding trail into the canyon, their eyes scanning every rock, every shadow. They stopped 100 yards from the cabin, a clear, non-threatening distance. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a noble, weathered face and a single eagle feather in his hair, raised an open palm, the sign of peace. Matt stepped onto the porch, his own rifle held at a non-aggressive angle, pointed at the ground. His mind raced. This wasn't a random raid. They were looking for something, or someone. The leader dismounted and took a few steps forward. "You are the man they call Stone?" he asked in surprisingly clear, though heavily accented English. "I am," Matt said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "This is my land. State your business." The Apache warrior's eyes were piercing, seeming to look right through Matt. "We are Chiricahua. We search for a child. A girl lost from the band of Chief Taza 3 winters ago. Her name is Nalin. We followed a whisper on the wind, a trader's tale of a solitary rancher with a native child." Matt's world tilted on its axis. Nalin. A name he'd never known. His Lily. He felt her small presence behind him, pressing against his back through the cabin door. The warrior's gaze flickered to the doorway, and his hard face softened almost imperceptibly. Her mother's heart has been an empty vessel. Her grandfather, a great leader, grows old and asks the spirits to see her one last time. He took another step. "We mean you no harm. We have come for our own." Matt's throat went dry. This was the moment he had always dreaded, the one he had pushed to the back of his mind. He knew she wasn't his to keep. He knew she belonged to a people, a culture, a family. But knowing it and living it were 2 entirely different things. The thought of letting her go was a physical pain, a tearing in his chest worse than any bullet. He felt a tug on his shirt. Lily Nalin stepped out from behind him. She stood on the porch, a strange figure in her settler's dress, and looked at the Apache warriors. She showed no fear, only a deep, searching curiosity. She was looking at the faces of her people. The leader's eyes widened. He let out a soft exclamation in his own tongue. He spoke to her, his voice gentle, the words flowing like water over stones. Lily listened, her head tilted. Then she replied her own Apache words, hesitant at first, rusty from disuse, but then gaining confidence. A language Matt had never heard her speak. She was one of them. It was as undeniable as the sunrise. She turned and looked at Matt, and in her eyes he saw a devastating conflict. Her entire world, the one he had so carefully built for her, was being ripped in two. Her hand found his, and her grip was desperate. "Go with them, Lily." Matt said the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. "They are your family, your people." Tears welled in her eyes, the first he had seen her shed since the day he'd found her. "You are my family," she choked out. "I'll always be your family," he said, his own voice breaking. He knelt, his bad leg screaming in protest, so he could look her in the eye. "But your heart has roots I can't give you. You need to be with them, to learn their ways. It's who you are." He was letting her go. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. The warrior who introduced himself as Coyotes, a name that carried the weight of legend, though this was a younger man, perhaps a nephew of the great chief, nodded his head in a gesture of profound respect to Matt. "You have shown honor, Stone," Coyotes said. "You protected one of our own. The Chiricahua will not forget this. Our people will not trouble your land." "This I swear." They gave her a proper buckskin dress they had brought. As she changed, she transformed. The settler girl vanished, and an Apache child stood in her place. It was like watching a hawk shed the feathers of a dove. She belonged. The parting was swift and brutal. She hugged Matt fiercely, burying her face in his rough shirt. "Do not forget me," she whispered. "Never," he promised, his voice thick with unshed tears. He watched as they lifted her onto a horse. She looked back one last time, her small face a portrait of heartbreak and destiny. Then the riders turned and moved back up the trail, disappearing over the ridge as silently as they had come. Matthew Stone stood on his porch until they were long gone, until the sun was high in the sky. The canyon was silent again. But this was not the peaceful silence he had once craved. It was a hollow, gaping, deafening silence. The little desert flower was gone, plucked from his life, leaving him more broken and more alone than ever before. The silence Narlin left behind was a cancer. It ate away at the edges of Matt's life, devouring the small pockets of light she had created. The cabin felt cavernously empty. The routines they had shared now felt like hollow rituals. He'd catch himself turning to share a thought, only to be met with the empty chair by the fireplace. He'd find her slate with a half-finished line of letters and feel a fresh wave of grief wash over him. The promise from Coyotes held true. He was never troubled by the Apache. In fact, on 2 occasions, he found a freshly killed deer left near his spring, a silent gift of gratitude from a people who did not forget a debt. But this peace with the natives only served to further isolate him from the settlers. Rumors in Dust Devil Creek, fanned by Silas Kane, twisted the story. Matt Stone wasn't just a sympathizer. He was in league with them. A squaw man who had harbored a hostile and then sent her back to her people filled with his secrets. Kane, seeing Matt's spirit crushed and his reputation in tatters, renewed his campaign with vigor. The attacks became more brazen. Cattle were not just scattered. They were rustled and driven off in the night. His well was fouled with a dead animal, forcing him to spend a week cleaning it. His name was mud in town. Miller's Mercantile would still sell to him, but the credit he once enjoyed was gone. He had to pay in cash, and cash was a resource that was rapidly dwindling. The years began to blur, each one harder than the last. The ranch decayed around him. The roof of the barn he never rebuilt rotted away. The fences sagged. The broken spur was living up to its name more every day. Matthew himself seemed to wither with it. His hair turned a stark white. The lines on his face deepened into gullies of sorrow and hardship. His limp grew more pronounced, the pain in his leg a constant nagging companion. He was aging a decade for every year that passed. He was the forgotten rancher once more, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. He clung to the memories of Lily of Narlin. He kept her slate, the worn copy of the Bible they had read, from a small, intricate bird she had carved for him from a piece of cottonwood. These were his holy relics. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would talk to her, as if she were still there, telling her about his day, about the hawk he saw circling the canyon, about how the spring was still running clear. It was the only thing that kept him sane. 8 years after she left, things came to a head. It was 1889. The territory was changing. The Apache wars were drawing to a bloody close. Geronimo had surrendered a few years prior. The reservations were becoming permanent fixtures, and the last pockets of free native land were being swallowed up by men like Silas Kane. Kane had become more powerful than ever. He was now a county commissioner with the law in his pocket and a small army of hired thugs at his command. He had acquired almost all the land surrounding the Broken Spur. Matt's ranch was the last piece of the puzzle, the stubborn holdout that denied him total control of the canyon and its precious water. One morning, a man wearing a tin star rode up to Matt's cabin. He wasn't the town marshal. He was one of Kane's men, given a badge to make his thuggery legal. He handed Matt an official-looking document. It was an eviction notice. "Tax delinquency," the man said with a smirk. "According to county records, you're 3 years behind on your property taxes. Mr. Kane, as a civic-minded citizen, has paid your debt. The deed now transfers to him. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises." Matt stared at the paper. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. He had paid his taxes every year, trekking to the territorial office in Tucson to make sure it was done right, precisely because he didn't trust the local officials in Kane's pocket. He had the receipts in a lockbox inside. But he knew it didn't matter. This wasn't about the law. This was the final move in Kane's long game. "I have the receipts," Matt said, his voice a low growl. "The records in the county seat say otherwise," the fake marshal replied coolly. "You can take it up with the judge. But by the time he hears your case, you'll be long gone from here. Be out by Friday sunrise, or we'll remove you." The man wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving Matt standing in the dust, the false document clenched in his fist. For a moment, he felt a crushing wave of despair. He was an old man. His body ached. His spirit was worn thin. Maybe it was time to give up, to walk away and die in some dusty gutter. He walked back inside the cabin, his home for over 20 years. He ran a hand over the rough-hewn table where he and Lily had shared so many meals. He looked at the small cot where she had slept. He picked up the small wooden bird she had carved. Its lines were smooth and perfect. He remembered her small, determined face as she worked on it, her tongue sticking out in concentration. No. A fire long dormant kindled in his chest. Kane could take his land. He could take his cattle. He could even take his life. But he would not desecrate this place. He would not let that snake trample on the memories of the only happiness he had known since his family died. If Silas Kane wanted the Broken Spur, he would have to take it over Matthew Stone's dead body. He spent the next day preparing. He wasn't planning to run. He was preparing for a siege. He brought his last sacks of flour and beans inside. He filled every bucket and pot with water from the spring. He cleaned and oiled his Winchester, his shotgun, and the old Colt revolver he hadn't worn in years. He was outnumbered. He was outgunned. He knew he was going to die. But he would die on his feet, on his own land, defending the memory of his daughter, As the sun set on his last day, casting long shadows across the canyon, Matthew Stone sat on his porch shotgun across his lap and waited for the dawn. He felt a strange sense of peace. He was finally going to see Martha and Samuel again. And maybe he hoped he'd be able to tell them he'd done one last good thing with his broken life. The sunrise on Friday was a bloody smear on the horizon. Matt watched it from the cabin window, a mug of black coffee growing cold in his hand. He hadn't slept. The night had been spent listening, waiting. Now, with the first light, they came. There were 10 of them, led by Cain himself, who sat astride a fine black stallion, looking more like a conquering general than a county commissioner. His hired guns, including the familiar ugly faces of Pike and Colby, spread out in a semicircle, their rifles glinting in the morning sun. "Stone!" Cain's voice boomed across the clearing, dripping with triumphant arrogance. "Your time is up. Come out with your hands empty, and I'll let you walk away with your life." Matt's answer was a single defiant shot from his Winchester. The bullet whizzed past Cain's head, close enough to make him flinch and his horse rear up. The shot wasn't meant to kill. It was a statement. This far and no further. "Fool!" Cain screamed, his composure shattered. "Fire, burn him out!" The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. Bullets splintered the cabin's pine logs. A slug shattered the window frame next to Matt's head, spraying him with wood and glass. He ducked below the sill, his heart pounding. He was an old man, not the young soldier who had weathered the storm at Shiloh. He fired back methodically, making each shot count, aiming for cover, rather than men trying to pin them down. But he was just one man. Cain's men, emboldened by their numbers, began to advance, using the rocks and corrals for cover. Pike and Colby led a charge towards the front porch. Matt switched to the shotgun. He waited until they were 30 yards out, then unleashed both barrels. The roar of the gun was deafening inside the small cabin. The blast of buckshot tore through the air, forcing the men to dive for cover, Colby clutching a bleeding arm. But they kept coming. They were relentless. A Molotov cocktail, a bottle filled with kerosene, and a lit rag sailed through the air and crashed against the side of the cabin. Flames began to lick at the dry wood. Smoke started to fill the room. Matt was trapped. He could stay inside and burn or go outside and be shot to pieces. He coughed, his eyes stinging. He thought of Narlin. He hoped she was safe. He hoped she had found happiness with her people. His last thought was a prayer that she would never know how he died. He braced himself against the door, ready to make one final hopeless charge. And then he heard it. It was a sound that did not belong to the chaos of the gunfight. It was a high, piercing cry from the ridge above, a sound that was half human, half hawk. It was a war cry. Suddenly the world changed. An arrow fletched with eagle feathers sprouted from the chest of one of Cain's men. He collapsed without a sound. Another man screamed as an arrow pierced his thigh, pinning him to the ground. From the rocks above, a storm of arrows descended upon Cain's men, silent, swift, and deadly. Panic erupted. Cain's hired guns, who were brave enough when facing a single old man, broke and ran in terror from the unseen, silent attackers. They fired wildly into the rocks, but their shots were answered with more arrows and the crack of Apache rifles. Matt stumbled onto the porch, his eyes wide with disbelief. Figures were moving along the ridgeline, appearing as if from the very rock itself. They were Apache warriors, at least 20 of them, moving with fluid grace, their attacks coordinated and devastating. And then he saw their leader. She was on a painted war pony, at the crest of the highest rock, silhouetted against the morning sky. She was not a chief in the way a white man would understand it. She was a war leader, chosen for her cunning, her courage, and her spirit. She moved with an authority that was absolute, directing the attack with sharp, decisive hand signals. She was tall and slender, her face set with a cold, focused fury. Her long black hair flowed freely behind her. In her hand, she held not a bow, but a Winchester rifle, and she used it with expert precision. Cain, in a blind panic, tried to rally his crumbling men. He raised his pistol to fire at the figure on the ridge. But she was faster. The rifle in her hands bucked, and a fraction of a second later, the pistol was shot from Cain's hand, his fingers mangled and bloody. He screamed in pain and shock. The warriors descended from the rocks, overwhelming the last of the resistance. Cain was dragged from his horse and thrown to the ground. The fighting was over in less than 5 minutes. The leader trotted her horse down into the canyon and came to a stop before Matt's porch. The warriors parted for her with a reverence that bordered on awe. She dismounted and walked towards him. Her face was a mask of stern authority, but as she drew closer, Matt could see the faint, familiar lines around her eyes and mouth. Her eyes, those dark, ancient eyes, were the same ones that had stared at him from a crevice in the rocks all those years ago. She stopped in front of him. The smoke from the smouldering fire curled around them. "Matthew," she said. Her voice was deeper now, imbued with a power and resonance that commanded respect. But underneath it, he could still hear the girl he knew. He was speechless, his mind struggling to comprehend the vision before him. "Lily." He finally whispered the name, feeling inadequate. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "My name is Nylin," she said softly. "But yes, it is me." She was no longer the child he had saved. She was a woman, a leader, a force of nature. Years of hardship training and leadership had forged her into something new, something powerful. She had returned not as a memory, but as a savior, a tribal chief leading her warriors, appearing at his darkest hour, like an avenging angel from the wilderness. The forgotten rancher had been saved, and his salvation was the girl he had once pulled from the jaws of the Coyotes. The aftermath of the battle was surreal. Nalin's warriors moved with quiet efficiency, securing Cain and the surviving thugs, tending to the fire on the cabin, and collecting the weapons of the fallen. Matt simply stood on his porch, leaning against a post for support, his mind reeling. Nalin approached him, her stern warrior's facade melting away to reveal the woman beneath. Her eyes roamed over his aged face, his white hair, the deep lines of hardship etched into his skin. "You have grown old, Matthew," she said, a hint of sorrow in her voice. "And you have grown up," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Nalin, they called you a chief." "I am a war leader of my band," she explained. "My grandfather, the old chief, saw fire in me. You taught me to read your words and your world. My people taught me to read the earth and the heart of the warrior. I learned to blend the two. When raiders and soldiers threatened us, I led the fight. My people gave me this honor." She told him her story in clipped, direct sentences. After leaving him, she had relearned the ways of the Apache but never forgot what he had taught her. Her knowledge of English and the white man's thinking made her an invaluable counsel to her chief. Her courage and strategic mind, a blend of Apache cunning, and the logical problem-solving Matt had instilled in her, made her a natural leader in battle. She had risen not just to protect her people but to guide them through a changing, ever more dangerous world. "But how did you know I was in trouble?" Matt asked, bewildered. "The whispers of the land are carried on the wind," she said, a faint, mystical smile on her lips. "And my scouts are the eyes of the hawk. We heard that the snake Cain was finally moving to strike the old man in the canyon of the Broken Spur. the man who had shown honor to the Chiricahua. A debt had to be paid. She turned to face the trussed-up Silas Kane, who was glaring at them with pure hatred. "This man," Nylin said, her voice turning to ice, "has stolen land from my people as well. He has poisoned our water holes, and his men have hunted us for bounty. His fate is not for your laws to decide. It is for ours." Matt nodded slowly. He knew what that meant. He felt no pity for Kane. The man had earned his fate 12 times over. Nalin's warriors took Kane and his men and disappeared back into the mountains, leaving a profound silence in their wake. In the days that followed, Matt and Nalin rediscovered each other. The dynamic between them was no longer father and child. They were two adults, a man and a woman, forged by the same harsh land, their lives forever bound by a single act of kindness in a desolate canyon. She helped him repair the cabin. As they worked, they talked. He told her of his lonely years, of the way he held on to her memory. She told him of her life with her people, of the burdens of leadership, of the constant struggle to preserve their way of life. One evening they sat by the fire the way they used to. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. "Will you stay?" Matt asked the question he was terrified to voice. Nalin looked into the flames, her profile strong and beautiful in the flickering light. "My path is with my people, Matthew. I must lead them, protect them. It is my duty." Matt's heart sank. He had gotten her back, only to lose her again. She turned to him, and her hand covered his. Her touch was warm, strong. But a leader must also have a place where her own heart can rest. A place of peace. She looked around the small, battered cabin. This is a good place, a strong place. She leaned in, and for the first time she kissed him. It was not a kiss of girlish affection. It was a kiss between equals, a kiss that spoke of shared hardship, of deep respect, and of a love that had survived years' distance and the chasm between two worlds. It was a love that had been planted as the gratitude of a child and had now bloomed into the passion of a woman. "I will not stay," she said softly against his lips. "But I will always return. The broken spur will be my home as much as the mountains are. And you, Matthew Stone, you will be my heart's home." Matthew Stone, the forgotten rancher, pulled her close. He was no longer forgotten. He was loved by a chief or a warrior, a legend. Their future would not be easy. She was an Apache leader, and he was a white rancher. Their worlds were destined for conflict. But here in the quiet solitude of the canyon, under the vast, star-filled Arizona sky, they had carved out a space that belonged only to them. He had saved a girl from the Coyotes, and in return, she had saved him from a life of loneliness and despair. She had returned to him, bridging the divide between two peoples with the simple, unbreakable strength of their love. Theirs was a story that would become a whisper on the wind, a legend told by two peoples, a testament to the fact that even in the most broken of lands, the most unlikely hearts could find a way to make a home. The story of Matthew Stone and the Apache chief Nalin doesn't end there. It becomes a quiet legend, a testament to the bridges that can be built between even the most divided worlds. Theirs is a reminder that courage isn't just found in the heat of battle, but in the quiet, stubborn act of loving someone against all odds. It proves that a single act of compassion can ripple through time, returning as a wave of salvation when it's needed most. If this story of unlikely love and unbreakable spirit moved you, if you believe that heroes are often found in the most forgotten places, then please help us keep these legends alive. Hit that like, button to show your appreciation, share this story with someone who needs to hear a tale of true grit and redemption, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. We have so many more stories buried in the dust of the Old West, waiting to be told. Click subscribe and join us as we continue to explore the epic sagas of the American frontier. Thank you for listening.